welcome everyone. I'm extremely happy to be here today and to present to you this lecture on the science and pseudoscience of nonverbal communication. As mentioned just a few seconds ago, my name is Vincent Denault. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University. And this subject is a subject that I've been working on for quite a few years now. And the presentation will go as follow. So you have just in front of you the lecture plan. So we'll address what the peer review process is, then we'll address the question of experiential knowledge versus scientific knowledge, and then what is really nonverbal communication, the science of nonverbal communication, the issue of unfounded and discredited claims, and we'll set the record straight about some of those unfounded and discredited claims, what should be remembered about nonverbal communication, and then we'll jump to the pseudoscience of nonverbal communication, and why do some organizations turn to pseudoscience. We will conclude this presentation, this lecture, on the issue of how to obtain the truth, which is one of the reasons why many of you might be interested in nonverbal communication, and then we'll conclude and see what's next. So there will be a second lecture on December 8th. So if you feel, if you like this lecture, I invite you to join us again on December 8th. So first thing first, it is extremely important to understand what the peer review process is, because if we don't understand what the peer review process is, and you like nonverbal communication, then after this presentation, you will probably go on Google and you will type in body language and nonverbal communication, and then you will find very incredible claims about nonverbal communication, body language, and you will not really be able to decide what to make of those claims if you don't really understand what the peer review publication is, which is at the foundation of the scientific knowledge, the development of scientific knowledge. So for those of you who don't know, when a researcher do a research, the researcher will write a manuscript. The manuscript can last around 30 pages. That's just an example. And in this manuscript, let's say that almost 20 pages of those 30 pages will explain the process that comes before the conclusion. So therefore, anyone reading the manuscript will be able to evaluate the claims in full knowledge of the fact. Why is that? Because the process that comes before the conclusion is available. So once you have this manuscript, then as a researcher, you will submit it to a journal, to a scientific. There are thousands of scientific journals. There are good journals and there are other journals that might be questionable, but that's another story. So you submit it to a journal, your manuscript, and then this manuscript there's a first evaluation, so to speak, by the editor of the journal, who will determine, for example, if it is a good fit for the journal. If, for example, you submit an article about art to a journal about, I don't know, social psychology, and there is absolutely no link between the topic of the article and the topic of the journal, then the editor might say, well, this might not be a good fit. If the editor makes this first assessment and determine, well, it's a good fit, there's no, for example, if the editor look at your manuscript and there's really big mistakes, or there's like very, the writing is very bad, then you might still not send your manuscript to the evaluations. But if it passes the editor's test, so to speak, your manuscript will be sent to reviewers. And the reviewers will look at your manuscript and evaluate the claims in a very critical manner. And the reason why they can do that, it is because the process that comes before the conclusion is available. So the reviewers often will be blind. What it means is that they will not know who wrote the scientific paper, the manuscript, sorry. And if it's double blind, you don't know who the evaluators are, the reviewers are, and they don't know who wrote the paper. And then the reviewers will review your manuscript, and then they will make a critical assessment of what you did. With that critical assessment, what the reviewers will do is then send back the manuscript to the editor, and the editor will make a decision if it is published or not published. There are other possibilities. It can be published with minor revision, major revision, it can be rejected, or it can be what is called revise and resubmit. So in other words, there is potential with your paper, but there's a lot of things to work on. So therefore it will not be published right now, but you can still submit it to this journal again if you make a big revision of your paper. Ultimately, and that's the last point, if your paper is ultimately published, then your paper was peer-reviewed. But that is very important to understand that that's just the start of the development of scientific knowledge. Because now, once your manuscript is published, it is available to almost everyone in the world. So the international research community can now assess and criticize the results of your paper in full knowledge of the fact. And why is that? Because the process that comes before the conclusion is accessible. And that is really the main point of peer review publication. So sometimes there are papers that are published that really the evaluation or the review was not done properly. This happens. But if it is published, now other researchers can respond to this paper or criticize this paper, and they can do it. How and why? Because they have access to the process that comes before the conclusion. They can criticize in full knowledge of the fact. And this is extremely important in the development of scientific knowledge. So once you know what the peer review process is, now let's look at nonverbal communication. And just before I go to nonverbal communication, I just want to say something, and I find it very important. Today, what I share with you is based on peer review publication. So I'm sharing with you scientific knowledge. But I'm not saying that experiential knowledge, so the knowledge that practitioners gain on the field, is not important. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just sharing with you scientific knowledge, and here this image are what we can assume two friends holding hands, or a couple, whatever. I feel like scientific knowledge and experiential knowledge can walk hand in hand to develop better professional practices. What is important is to understand the limits of each type of knowledge, and they both have limits. So just as a reminder, when I talk about scientific knowledge, I'm not saying that experiential knowledge is not important. Not at all. Okay? So what is nonverbal communication? What is this thing that we hear a lot about in the media or on the web? Well, nonverbal communication is usually defined as communication through means other than words. So what does it mean? It means that facial expression, for example, or physical characteristic or vocal characteristics, gestures, they transmit information. They create impressions on our day-to-day life. Oh, you have facial expression, physical characteristic, vocal characteristics, gestures, gaze, touch, the environment, what is around you. When you saw my image a few minutes ago, because of the environment that I'm in, it created impressions with regards to Vincent Denault. Or you might have said, well, he looks trustworthy or not, or he looks professional or not. He looks like he's more expressive or not. But these are some impressions that can be created when you see the environment. The same as when you see my physical characteristic or facial characteristics. Because I have a beard and my hair is short, it created impressions. And that's just the way it is. Other elements of nonverbal communication, those communication through touch or environment or proxemics, the distance. When you speak to someone, for example, this creates impression, this transmits information, and this is all part of nonverbal communication. The same with chronemics. It refers to the study of time. If you arrive early or late at a meeting, it creates impressions. Not necessarily the impression you want to create, but it does change the interaction scene. So this is what and there are other examples, but these are some of the examples that where on a daily basis, those elements, they transmit information and they create impressions. And they influence our day-to-day interaction, our face-to-face interaction, but also other interaction, for example, mediated through computers. And these elements of nonverbal communication, what is important to understand is that they are studied by a whole community of researchers around the world. A few years ago, a colleague and I, we published this paper that you see on the screen. It was about the most cited papers on visible nonverbal behavior. And to understand the most cited papers, we had to look at a variety of other papers. We had to create a corpus of papers to understand and find out what the most cited papers were. So to create that corpus, what it has shown, so we saw the most cited, but if we look back, well, the research on nonverbal communication, it's really done by a worldwide community of researchers. That's extremely important to remember. And researchers come from various disciplines: psychology, communication, neuroscience, psychiatry, biology, ethology, computer science, and more with the development of new technologies. So really, nonverbal communication is not a subject that is studied by only a small area of research. I could add anthropology, sociology. So what I tell my students is that if you want to learn more about nonverbal communication, you can understand more about nonverbal communication and study it from a various perspective. And really, if you change discipline, it's really the lens through which you will look at this issue, the issue of nonverbal communication. And there are thousands of peer-reviewed publications. Most of them are in English. And the issues that are addressed in those papers are, there's a plethora of issues. Culture, the impact of culture on nonverbal communication, pain, autism, emotion recognition, dominance, empathy, children, mental health, mimicry, interpersonal sensitivity, thin slide judgment, and so on and so forth. So these are all elements where nonverbal communication plays a role, and this is studied by the worldwide community of researchers. And what is very interesting to know is that although deception detection and lie detection is the subject that is the most popular around with the public, this area of research is really small, is really a fraction of the peer-reviewed publications on nonverbal communication. It's still what is popular among the public. And when you discuss with people that are outside of the research environment, and you tell them, well, and we'll go to that in a moment, but tell them that, well, nonverbal communication is really not what you think it is when it's presented in television series as a way to detect liars in a glance. Well, what is presented on television is really not based on facts and science. And then you tell that to the public and they say, well, if it's not useful to detect lies, then what's the use of nonverbal communication? And that kind of is a good illustration of how much the attention of the public is focused on lie detection, when in fact, nonverbal communication plays a huge role in our daily life, our daily interaction. And most of it happens outside of conscious awareness. So maybe that's a reason why people don't realize how much nonverbal communication is important in their daily life. So when you look at nonverbal communication, you see not only is it studied by a worldwide community of researchers, but it's also published in different journals of different disciplines, different methodologies, and really it is a worldwide community of researchers. So these are tables from the paper that we published a few years ago. And actually, the research on nonverbal communication, on visible nonverbal behavior, that was the focus of this paper. Well, it really there is more and more research on the subject, which is a great thing actually. And this graph again from this paper that we published a few years ago shows it quite explicitly. So there's the science of nonverbal communication. So all this knowledge, peer-reviewed, published, accessible to criticism, where the process that comes before the conclusion is available to everyone. This is the science of nonverbal communication, and it addresses a variety of subjects and issues. However, there are a lot of claims that are unfounded or discredited about nonverbal communication. And those claims, in 2009, there was this television series named Lie to Me. And well, there was quite arguably a lot of things that were presented in that series that were not really based on scientific evidence. But unfounded and discredited claims about nonverbal communication, it didn't start in 2009. Okay, so it started thousands of years ago. Here you have on your screen you have a translation of a religious text that was published almost 3,000 years ago. That's a translation from 1845, but the source of that dates back almost 3,000 years ago. And in this papyrus, in this text, there were instructions on how to discover if someone wanted to poison you. So this is kind of one of the many examples all throughout history where really behavior and observation was considered a way to find the truth. And that's just one example out of many others, but all throughout histories, there were ways to detect the guilty people and to spot the innocent. And a lot of those techniques, well, they were based on the observation. So they were not presented as nonverbal communication techniques, but what they invited people to do was actually observe and look at behaviors and physical characteristics. So the unfounded and discredited claims about nonverbal communication, it doesn't start recently. It's really an old tradition. If you look at those unfounded and discredited claims, there are many of them that you can find over the web. Okay, claims such as the body never lies, the combinations of behavioral clues allow light detection in face-to-face interaction with observation only. Nonverbal behavior accounts for 7% of communication. Tears are a reliable sign of remorse. Nonverbal behavior can be read like a book. Terrorists can be detected by their nonverbal behavior alone. People are good at detecting lies by observation alone. These are some of the unfounded and discredited claims that you can find on the web and in books. But let me look at some of them. Let me just look with you at some of them. Well, first of all, when it comes to nonverbal behavior can be read like a book, this is not serious. Actually, I'll just quote Judith Hall in a paper published in 2019, and she could not have said it. I could not have said it better than she did. There is no dictionary on nonverbal cue meanings because contextual factors involving encoders' intention, their other verbal and nonverbal behavior, other people who they are and their behavior, and the setting will all affect the meaning. I mean, what else can I say? Tears are reliable sign of remorse. if you are there in a few weeks on the presentation about stereotypes in the courtrooms, this has huge consequences. Such tears are reliable sign of remorse. This is I would say this is bullshit. Okay? And you could say, well, Vincent, you should not use this word in the presentation. Well, I'll use it. And why is it that, by the way, bullshit is a subject that is studied scientifically. Just go on any uh, search engine for scientific papers, and there are many researchers who work on bullshit. Tears are not reliable signs of remorse. That's a fact. And the belief of the opposite, if judges believe that tears are reliable signs of remorse, this can be a cause of concerns because remorse can play a huge role in the justice settings. So the fact is that there is no evidence that facial expression, body language, or other physiological matter exists that can identify feelings of remorse. And just that's a fact. And the author Susan Bandes mentioned it quite eloquently. How do you distinguish in a courtroom remorse from guilt, from shame? I mean, but the system sometimes is based on the fact that judge can catch remorses. These are questions that I will address on December 8th. So the fact is that tears are not reliable signs of remorse. And there's also ample evidence that evaluation of remorse is heavily influenced by factors such as race, ethnicity, mental disability, and age. So you see the potential consequences. I'll address that later. Combinations of behavioral cues allow lie detection in face-to-face interaction by observation only, I would add. Well, the research has shown that deception cues are generally faint and unreliable, and their use has been shown not to significantly improve lie detection accuracy, and therefore the initial warning to look for clusters, change, and contradiction becomes trivial. This quote refers to the issue of body language trainings. And in what you can read on about body language trainings, and when those trainings are given, sometimes the trainers and might say that, well, don't jump to conclusion, look for many cues. So if you have more cues, you have a better indication that someone might be lying. Well, this call for caution is worth nothing if the cues that you look at are worth nothing. And actually, such a call for caution, well, look for many cues. This call for caution, well, it's worth nothing if the cues you look at are worth nothing, but it's worse than that. Is that if you look at many cues, you might be confident that you have found the lies. But in fact, your judgment might not be better than chance, but your confidence in your judgment might be really high because, well, I was told to look at many cues and I saw many cues. So this gap between the accuracy and confidence is really a huge problem. Imagine if a cop is really confident that you have lied to them and that you have committed a crime, but their judgment is wrong. Where could this lead? Well, researchers have addressed that in the past also. So really, it's not a matter of combination of cues. If the cues are worth nothing, the combinations is also worth nothing. Well, there's this idea that terrorists can be detected by the nonverbal behavior alone. And actually, there was a program in the United States, the SPOT program, that was essentially based on this idea. Well, the fact is that current scientific knowledge on nonverbal communication suggests that security and justice professionals, by the way, should not rely on the observation of behavioral indicators or combination of some of them in face-to-face interaction to detect terrorists. That's a fact. Nonverbal behavior accounts for 7% of communication. Well, that's just a wrong interpretation, or it's a misuse of real research that were published in the 60s. They were published by a great researcher named Albert Mehrabian. Excuse my French accent. But Albert Mehrabian never said that 7% of communication was nonverbal. The papers that he published in the 1960s addressed very specific element of communication, nonverbal communication. It was a word, the tone of the voice, and the facial expressions. And when the emotion communicated by the word was contradictory with the emotion communicated by the tone of the voice, or if the emotion was communicated by the tone of the voice was contradictory with emotion communicated by the facial expression, then the people who would look at someone would determine their emotional state based first on their face, then the tone of the voice, and then the words. That's just a very simple explanation of what was done in the 1960s. It was not about nonverbal behavior in general. It was not about communication in general. And those papers published in the 1960s, they were subject to criticism. So not only were they subject to criticism, but also they really were misquoted since then. And this is a quote actually from Albert Mehrabian that was featured in a book about where this myth about the 7% myth. Well, actually, I just realized that nonverbal behavior account for only 7% of the communication. Actually, I just made a typo here. The belief is that nonverbal behavior accounts for 93% of communication. The words are only 7%. But the explanation that I just told you is the same. Nonverbal behavior, Mehrabian did not say it was 93% of communication. So I apologize for that typo. And finally, there's this idea that the body never lies and people are good at detecting lies by observation alone. Well, meta-analyses have shown that nonverbal cues to detect lies are largely faint and unreliable, and lie detection accuracy using common visual nonverbal cues rarely exceeds chance. So I don't really know how else I can say it. The idea that the body never lies implies that there would be signs that are always telling the possibility that someone is lying. These signs do not exist. So there are tendency. Yes, liars have tendency in their nonverbal behavior, but those tendencies are usually faint and not reliable. So what is there to remember regarding nonverbal communication? Well, I invite you to remember that nonverbal communication, and it includes more than just the speaker's face. It provides participant feedback to coordinate, manage in-person exchanges on a moment-by-moment basis in the service of participant goal. Most of the nonverbal communication, the influence of nonverbal communication on a daily basis, it occurs much outside of conscious awareness. And the truth is that nonverbal cues can also be misleading, and it can result in systematic biases and stereotypes. So when this is not considered by people in position of power, it can result in harmful consequences. And trials is one of those examples. If a judge, for example, is sure that tears are a reliable sign of remorse, well, what happens if someone is really remorseful but don't show tears? Or the opposite, if someone is not remorseful and he's practiced and she practiced, or he or she practiced, and the tears appear, well, this can have huge consequences. Okay, we are talking about the life and liberty of people. And in some countries, it is sometimes a matter of life or death, where there's the death penalty. So the other things that I don't address that because I only have 1 hour, but also remember that culture plays a role, an important role, in how we show nonverbal communication and how we assess it. And there are cultural differences. And by cultural differences, I don't when we think about culture, it's not a matter of countries. I mean, there are cultures, several cultures in a country, and there's all several subcultures to cultures. And even if I was raised in Quebec, the culture where I was raised in can be very different from the culture of my neighbor right here. So these learnings that we gather over the course of our life, they influence the way we perceive others and the way we are perceived. It influences our daily life-to-life interaction. So you have the science of you have nonverbal communication. There's this issue, nonverbal communication. You have researchers studying it, okay? And you have also unfounded and discredited claims about nonverbal communication. That's one thing. But sometimes those unfounded and discredited claims are presented as if they were scientific. And this is where unfounded and discredited claims becomes more of pseudoscientific claims, because these are claims that are just wrong, but they are presented as scientific, as a result of scientific research. So what is a pseudoscience more generally? They are disciplines that possess the superficial appearance of science but lack its substance. So more informally, pseudoscience are imposters of science. They do not play by the rules of science. And even though they mimic some of its outward features. So as a consequence, the pseudoscience, well, they can easily mislead untrained observers into concluding that they possess scientific merit. So this is what pseudoscience is. And you have many, if you just browse through internet, you will find many pseudoscientific techniques about nonverbal communication. What they are bodies of unfounded and discredited claims. They are presented explicitly or implicitly, that's very important, as having scientific value. So those techniques will tell you that you can read people's mind, essentially. Well, sometimes they will not say that, but it will imply that. Okay, so that you can see what people are thinking, what people are feeling, and you can see that based on different behavior that you can analyze almost like a book, like a words in the dictionary. And those techniques, what is funny is that some of those characteristics are very typical of those pseudoscientific techniques. So those techniques, of course, they will say that they are based on research, but well, and they will name drop some researchers. And how to sell those techniques, one of the way to sell those techniques is to say that they are used by, for example, other practitioners for many years. They are used by the FBI, by the CIA, they are used by law enforcement, they are used by human resource professionals. But really, what is the worth of such a claim? We'll address that in a moment. And when those pseudoscientific techniques are criticized, well, one of the replies that will come is that, well, we are criticized or laughed at because what we are doing is revolutionary. Well, we'll see the weight of such an argument in a moment. And what is really typical of pseudoscientific techniques is that when they are presented with ground rules and caution statements. We'll go on that in a moment. So when a technique said that it is based on research, well, the question that you and practitioners should ask is, where is the peer review? If it's explicitly or implicitly presented as scientific, then there should be peer review publication. If you use science as an argument of authority, then you must play by the rules. So, and don't get me wrong, some of those techniques that, well, we have a peer review that showed, well, hold on a second. If there's only one peer review publication that supports your techniques, well, what's that publication? What's the limit of the results? Where was it published? Who published it? has this paper been subject to commentaries and response? What's the weight of this paper that you should give to it? Because if there's an extraordinary claims in that paper, then there should be extraordinary evidence. So, and by the way, such techniques sometimes they will claim that their stuff is peer reviewed, and they will give papers to justify that. Well, you should read the paper, because sometimes what is said about the paper is not something that the authors of the paper actually said. And in such pseudoscientific techniques, also a question that you can ask yourself when you read it, or you read about it, or someone talk to you about it, is the process that comes before the conclusion accessible? So I would say with a lot of caution that if someone was to publish a book about this technique, well, we should add in that if the person presents his technique as scientific, or is presented explicitly or implicitly, then there should be an access to what comes before the conclusion, so that everyone can judge the technique in full knowledge of the fact. Okay, so these are kind of when someone tells you, and that goes for almost, I would say it goes far beyond nonverbal communication. If someone tells you that something is based on research and use science as an argument, then the person should be ready to provide the sources. Then you have this argument that is used by pseudoscientific technique that, well, it's used by a large number of practitioners for many years. Well, that's just an argument of authority or seniority. These are logical fallacies, and they do not prove that the technique works. There are things that are thousands of years old, and they are tradition. And there's absolutely no evidence that it works. Okay, that's just an argument of authority or seniority. Then I really like that quote from Carl Sagan. When pseudoscientific techniques are criticized, well, the reply will be, well, we are criticized because what we suggest is revolutionary. Well, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at, well, it does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. And this is extremely important, what I'm about to say to you right now, is that those pseudoscientific techniques, they come with ground rules and caution statement. For example, you will hear and you will read that in those techniques, well, those techniques will say that the proponents of those techniques will say, well, there are no unique behavior associated with dishonesty or honesty. By the way, science is clear on that. You have to establish a baseline. You have to look for contradiction between channels. You have to look for deviation in nonverbal behavior. You have to consider the context. Well, how can you really expect someone to apply all those ground rules? And these are just a limited amount of ground rules. When you read about those techniques, there is a number of ground rules. Another example, this one. Deception cues depend on various factors, such as the perceived seriousness of the offense, the mental and physical condition of the subject, any underlying psychiatric and personality disorder, level of intelligence, degree of maturity, and the extent of or absence of social responsibility. Well, how can you really expect someone to apply all those caution statements or ground rules? The fact is that those ground rules and caution statements, they render the cues useless. So first, some of the cues that are presented are worth nothing. The accumulation of those cues is also therefore worth nothing. And then you have ground rules that you cannot really apply, so it makes the cues again worth nothing, because you cannot apply that. And those ground rules and cues, ground rules and caution statements, it's always a way to say, well, if the techniques didn't work, well, it means it's because you did not apply the ground rules. It's always a way to get out of the criticism. But those ground rules, how can you really expect someone to apply them? And also, is there evidence to show that the use of those ground rules is possible? And is there evidence to show that the use of the ground rules allows better decoding of nonverbal behavior? Well, if you want to read a little bit more about this issue, me and 50 other colleagues, we wrote a paper that was published in 2020 on the issue of pseudoscience in security and justice context. The paper is available for free. It's in French, English, and Spanish, so don't hesitate to have a look at that if the subject is of interest to you. So I'm starting slowly to come to the conclusion of this presentation. If there are unfounded and discredited claims about nonverbal communication, if there are pseudoscientific claims and pseudoscientific techniques about nonverbal communication, then why do some organizations turn to pseudoscience? Because there are organizations that have turned in the past and still turn to pseudoscience. Well, in this paper that we published in 2020, we suggested 5 hypotheses that might explain, so to speak, why some organizations turn to pseudoscience. The first one is the fact that organizations have problems to solve. The reality is that when an organization has a problem to solve, pseudoscientific claims, pseudoscientific techniques often offer immediate and easy solutions to complex challenges, unlike scientific knowledge. So if there's social pressure, political pressure, shareholder pressure, whatever pressure there is, if an organization has a problem and someone offers a way to solve the problem, this is an open door to pseudoscientific claim. It creates an environment where there will be an open ear to pseudoscientific claims. But there are other reasons why. Well, that's what we hypothesize. The other one is the fact that sometimes organizations, they lack scientific knowledge. And that's not a matter of bad faith. It's just that they have other issues to take care of. Well, if the organization doesn't know about the science on a specific subject, for example, the knowledge of the state of scientific research on nonverbal communication, it makes it easy to recognize the true nature of the indicator conveyed by pseudoscience. So in other words, if an organization knows about the science on the subject they have a problem on, then if someone comes to offer a solution and the organization knows the science about that issue or problems, well, it makes it easier to spot pseudoscientific claims or unfounded or discredited claims. But if the organization does not know about the state of science, then they can be more subject to being persuaded by extravagant claims that have not extravagant evidence. We have also argued that one of the other reasons why organizations might turn to pseudoscience is the fact that the organization ignore the importance of science. And what really is the importance of science is the fact that even if science is not perfect, it can be supported and criticized because everything is accessible to do so. Compared to pseudoscientific claims where really you must trust the claims almost blindly because the process that comes before the conclusion is not available. And without knowing the merit of the knowledge published in peer-reviewed publications, well, pseudoscientific claims really can appear much more enticing and reassuring by implementing marketing campaigns and using logical fallacies. Another hypothesis that we suggested was the fact that organizations underestimate the dangers of pseudoscience. And when it comes to security and justice context, what we addressed in that paper in 2020 is the fact that Pseudoscientific claims can result in failing to detect actual threat and misidentifying guilty individuals as innocent, but it can so result in misidentifying innocent individual as guilty. And this can result in not only a loss of time and money, but also it can result in reputational and legal and social consequences. These are the consequences of using pseudoscience. But, you know, there's those hypotheses are addressed at the organization. And again, it's not a question of good faith or bad faith. It's just the fact that organizations have sometimes other issues to deal with. But this, knowing what the science is and knowing what the science is about the subject where there's a problem is, in my opinion and the opinion of other researchers, essential to stop pseudoscientific claims and unfounded and discredited claims. But you see, researchers also have a responsibility. And that's important to remember. The international scientific community must promote more open science, more open access to knowledge published in scientific journals. It's important for the researcher to disseminate the knowledge to the public and disseminate it also to organizations in the fields, for example, in security and justice, that wish to implement evidence-based practices. So the researcher also have part of the responsibility of their shoulders. If we develop excellent knowledge, peer-reviewed publications, knowledge where you can criticize in full knowledge of the fact, knowledge that you can criticize because you have access to the process that comes before the conclusion. And this knowledge, if it's not accessible to organization, how can we expect the organization to implement this knowledge? So there is a part of the responsibility on the shoulder of researchers. So with that said, I just want to point out a few things that are important, because I've addressed myths about lie detection and stuff, and you might say, well, just on this specific subject, because there are other issues in nonverbal communication, but I just want to point you in the right direction. But if you tell me, well, Vincent, if we cannot detect lies based on nonverbal behavior, what should we do? Well, researchers have worked on that, and there are plenty peer-reviewed publication, and there are techniques that are supported by evidence. And I just want to point two things that are important when looking for the truth. It is important to establish rapport. So a feeling of empathy, a feeling that the person will not be, if I'm the investigator and I'm meeting with someone, I need to make sure that the person is in a good position, that I'm polite, that I show empathy, that I show that I will not judge the person for saying whatever she wants to say or he wants to say. So the importance of rapport, and this is where nonverbal communication is important. So you have to switch this idea that if you meet someone, then you will try to spot the lie. Just create an environment where a person will feel good. And how do you create an environment? Well, of course, with the words you say, how you say it, that's nonverbal communication, and how you act with the person. And the other element in those techniques, which, I mean, I'm just summarizing. That's almost, I don't do justice to the research on those issues. But I just want to say, because if some of you are interested in deception detection or the search for the truth, look out for those techniques and others. And what they say, well, those techniques, a lot of them say the importance of, argue about the importance of report. And they also argue about the importance of asking open-ended question and being prepared before you meet someone. So I just want to say that, because if some of you are interested in the subject, well, I would say nonverbal communication is important, but it's not really about detecting liars. It's about creating an environment where the truth, the people will be motivated to tell the truth, so to speak. And this, your nonverbal communication is important regarding that. So to conclude this presentation, what I want to say is that remember that we are all biased. And there's this issue, that there's this confirmation bias that it is especially important in the issue regarding nonverbal communication. Because, for example, if you think that someone is lying, you might see all the behaviors that confirm that the person is lying. But in fact, those behaviors actually can be shown by people who are telling the truth. If you see me for the first time and I'm telling you something and you think that I'm a liar, well, you might say that I'm nervous, that I'm looking away, that I'm hesitating, and that confirms your initial belief. But the fact is that if your initial belief is wrong, those behaviors just confirm something that is wrong. And in fact, I can be nervous because telling the truth makes me nervous. I can hesitate because I want to say the truth accurately. And I can look away because I'm stressed, because I have another meeting after. There are many reasons why people might exhibit what you consider to be signs of lie, but actually those behavior, they can be exhibited by people who are telling the truth. And the danger is this confirmation bias. So the intuition that you have regarding someone, if the person is truthful or not, is often based on the first impression. And then if you look for nonverbal behavior to confirm that, well, this opens a wide door about regarding confirmation bias. And that's also one of the reasons why the coding nonverbal behavior is such hazardous. In addition, with the fact that the grids that are suggested to decode nonverbal behavior are just based on nothing other than, anecdotes. Let's remember that I invite you to remember that pseudoscience is very attractive. And one thing that I really want to underline here, and I just want to emphasize it, and that's why I use the silence just before I say it, that's nonverbal communication, okay, is that proponents of pseudoscience are generally acting in good faith. So this is a personal position. I honestly think, and I might be wrong, but I honestly, sincerely think that most of the proponents of pseudoscience are acting in good faith. They really think that their stuff works, but it doesn't. And there are evidence to the contrary. So, however, even if they're acting in good faith, the reality is good faith is not a synonym of good practice. Good faith is not a synonym of good practice. And unfounded, discredited claims and pseudoscientific claims, they can have consequences. They really can have harmful consequences. I refer you to the paper we published in 2020. And final idea, human communication is an intricate process. The importance of nonverbal communication extends well beyond the detection of deception, which is a fairly small area of research when compared to other areas. So what's next? Well, nonverbal communication becomes right now, it is a subject of research by a worldwide community. But also right now, because of the pandemic, there are new issues about nonverbal communication that are important to address. One of them, which I will discuss a little bit on December 8th, is the issue of virtual justice. Because one of the things that change from face-to-face trials to virtual trials is nonverbal communication. The environment, what you see, what is the focus. So really, this is it. I saw when I was presenting some questions, but I won't be able to answer them. But if you have any questions, look, it's really easy to contact me. Don't hesitate. I will be happy to exchange with you. If I can answer the question, if I cannot, and then I will say it to you. But thank you very much for attending this lecture, and I hope to see you on December 8th. Be safe, take care, and thank you very much.